Hi, I'm Brian. I'm a blacksmithing instructor, and here's a project from one of my classes. Today I'm going to show you how to make these simple pliers. These are made from mild steel just because it's cheap and easy to forge, but you could do the same thing with carbon steel and get a sturdier product. You could also use this pattern to make a light pair of tongs, or use larger material and make a larger pair of tongs, though I recommend if you've never done this before that you start with pliers, because it's less time and material to commit while you're learning the techniques for the first time. Let's get into it. I'll cover terminology first because I use some terms interchangeably here. These are called the bits, the nibs, or the jaw of the tongs. This area that supports the rivet is called the boss, and these are either reins or handles. We'll be starting with two pieces of 1/4 by 3/4 mild steel flat bar, about 5 inches long. Start by upsetting the end of each bar. This thick part will become the jaw or the working end of the pliers, and it needs to be almost twice as thick as the original 1/4 inch material. Especially in these first few heats, the bar likes to bend, but if you keep going, a small foot will form that makes the process much easier going forward. I include the upsetting step in this project because it's a good technique to learn, and it reduces the amount of work that will be needed to draw the reins at a later step. If you want to streamline this process, you can skip upsetting entirely by starting with thicker stock and drawing everything down from there, which is much easier if you have a striker, press, or a power hammer available. To minimize bending of the bar during upsetting, we can quench off everything except the last half inch of material. I hold the bar in flat jaw tongs with the hot end facing up, push against the barrel to angle it in my tongs, and then I can easily quench the other end. When I get back to the anvil, I flip the piece over, pull it straight, and I'm in position ready to start upsetting. Quenching and getting back to the anvil quickly is the key to making progress here. As you build up thickness in the end of the bar, I find it helpful to visualize this triangle. Anytime you need to straighten or correct the upset end of the bar, come to the near edge of the anvil and make sure that your hammer angle matches that triangle. If you hit parallel with the anvil face, you're just going to be working against yourself, knocking out some of the thickness that you're working hard to build up. The next question is, how do you know when you've upset enough material? You could use calipers or a ruler to gauge when the thickness has doubled, but it's much easier to measure the length of a bar than its thickness. So we'll stop when the bar's length has been reduced by 1 inch. We started with 5 inches, so here I've marked my anvil at 4 inches from the edge. When my pieces fit within that mark, I know I've upset enough material. We don't want the bar to become wider, only thicker. So here I'm taking it back down to the original 3/4 inch width across the entire bar, leaving us with only the increase in thickness. This should leave us with two pieces, which are 4 inches long, 3/4 of an inch wide, and taper in thickness from 1/4 inch to about 1/2 inch at the very end. There are many ways to make tongs and pliers. This particular pattern uses half-faced blows to create 3 shoulders. I've marked the shoulders here in the order that we forge them. Shoulders 1 and 3 define the sizes of the bit, the boss, and the rein. Shoulder 2 creates a transition between the thickened bit and the thinner boss areas. Now we're making 2 identical halves here. Whatever you do to one half of the pliers, do the same to the other half, and they'll fit together. I'll use this tong blank to show how to create the 3 shoulders. Shoulder 1 is made on the near edge of the anvil. For shoulder 2, move to the far edge of the anvil, rotate the top of the piece a 1/4 turn away from your body, and angle the piece at 45 degrees to the anvil edge. For shoulder 3, rotate another 1/4 turn in that same direction, and bring the piece back perpendicular to the anvil edge. And here are those motions again from another view. It's very easy to rotate the wrong direction or forget the next step, so I suggest practicing these motions with cold steel a few times until you're confident. Alright, let's try it. Here are the motions again for shoulder 1, 2, and 3. For shoulder 1, I leave about 1/2 inch of the thickened material on the anvil face. Don't go too deep at this point, we're just roughing in this shape. For shoulder 2, we only need a small transition between the thin and thick parts of the bar, so we don't need to use much force here. For shoulder 3, make sure to push enough material past the anvil edge to leave at least 1 inch between shoulder 1 and shoulder 3. If these shoulders are too close together, you won't have room for the hole later and you'll have to start over. Now that they're established, I'll take another pass to refine all of the shoulders. I'm going to use the very heel of my hammer so that I can thin out the rein material without making shoulder 3 too deep. I'll also clean up shoulder 1 here and make it a little deeper if needed, and square up the bit material very lightly. We don't want to thin that out. I'd like to refine shoulder 2, but you can see that my tongs prevent me from holding the piece parallel with the anvil face. I'll create what's called a convenience bend by leaving my tongs in the way and hammering parallel to the anvil face. I can now sharpen shoulder 2 without my tongs getting in the way. Here I'll use the table of the anvil because it has a sharper corner. And when I'm done, it's easy to remove that convenience bend and straighten the bar. Next, I like to flip these around and draw out the reins. This makes the pieces easier to hold on to later. I'll start by forging down one corner, which helps prevent a fish mouth from forming at the end of the bar. Now I'll switch to my cross peen to quickly reduce material size, then back to my flat face to clean up the cross peen marks, going back and forth between those two. I use the peen just to speed this up. Alternatively, you could use a rounding hammer, use the corner or horn of the anvil as a fuller, or just use the flat face of your hammer for the entire process. It doesn't matter if the piece gets bent or looks ugly at this point, we're just trying to get the material where we need it. Now I draw a short taper on the end of the rein. This gives a little extra length and looks nice, but don't taper too much of the rein. We want most of it to be a rectangular cross section, especially where it meets the boss. We want more material in the direction the pliers rotate, as that's the direction that force will be applied to them when they're in use. This is creating some sharp corners that I'll want to knock off in the next step. If we forge all the way down one corner of a rectangular cross section, it tends to twist. Instead, I'll bounce back and forth between opposing corners to reduce the twisting. The exact length of the reins doesn't matter as long as they look good to you and both halves roughly match in length. Now I'll work my way back up the rein, rolling the piece underneath light hammer blows to create a slightly curved surface on the top of the rein where it will contact the hand. Now all of these steps did thicken the material back up, so I'll take another pass to reduce the thickness back down to the original 1/4 of an inch, all the way from the boss through the end of the rein. If the handles do end up thicker than the boss material, it doesn't prevent the pliers from working, I just think this makes them look more finished. Now that it's easier to hold on to these, let's flip them back around and finish the working end. First I'll knock the corners off the boss to make it a little bit rounder. These corners can get in the way and prevent the tongs from articulating, and it's easiest to knock them down now. Next, I want to make sure that the rein and the bit are roughly parallel. You can see my rein here is straight, but my bit is pointing up a little, so I'll angle my hammer and use the very toe of the hammer to force the bit down in line with the rein. I'll straighten it up and do this a few times, but I'm very careful not to reduce the width of the boss itself. For tongs, you generally leave the rein straight, but for pliers, it's nice to leave a little curve in the handles so that your fingers can fit in there more easily. Let's visualize how these will fit together. We draw a center line through the holes and between the bits. If we take away 1/2 of the pliers, you can see that the handle needs to bend first away from the center line, then gradually curve back to the center line. This can be done entirely at the anvil, but there's a shortcut that makes this much easier if you have a vise available. Clamp the boss along its width with all the rein material sticking above the vise jaws. Now you can lightly hold the tip of the rein with your tongs and hit sideways with a hammer just above the boss. This introduces a nice gradual curve that can then be refined at the anvil. When one handle looks nice, lay that piece on the anvil and try to match the other piece to it. Don't spend too much time here, we're just trying to get these close. We'll get everything lined up after they're joined together. If you're going to shape the bits, now's the time to do it. I'm putting a simple taper on mine which gives them a little more length while still being a strong shape. You could taper in both directions to make something more like needle nose pliers, but if you're using mild steel like I am, remember that it's very soft. If you take the bits too thin, they will bend easily. You should now have two pieces that are really starting to look like pliers. Don't worry if the bits don't line up right now. We're going to do a lot of alignment at the end after we've put them together. Now we'll punch the holes. If we start punching from the inside face, the bit will be in the way when we go to turn the piece over. Instead, let's start punching from the outside face, with the bit hanging off the far edge of the anvil. Here I have eyeballed the center of mass for the boss, and I'm just punching in through the outside face. Now as I turn the piece over, the bit is not in my way. I can find the dark spot where my punch cooled off the material from the other side, drive through this side of the material, and push the plug out over the pritchel hole. Alternatively, you could start punching from the inside face and then finish your hole on a thick bolster block instead of the pritchel hole. Punching tends to put a curve in the boss. To flatten this, you might be inclined to hang it over the far edge of the anvil and hammer it flat. But if you do this repeatedly, you'll thin the boss out. Instead, I set the bit on the anvil, and lightly bend the boss the other direction. Then flip it back over to straighten it on the anvil face. I'll be making a rivet out of 3/8 inch round stock, so I need my holes to be about that same size. If you're careful with your punch, you could leave behind a hole that size, but I prefer to use a drift for better consistency between the holes. If you haven't made a drift before, it's very easy and can be done with mild steel. Check out the video linked above to see how I do it. And once we've got the hole sized, again, we want to flatten the boss area back out, making sure not to thin it any more than is necessary. We'll need to do some cold work to get these pieces fitting together prior to riveting. I'm going to focus mainly on shoulder 1 and shoulder 2, as this is where the two halves tend to hang up. For shoulder 1, I'm going to file the inside corner of the bit where it transitions into the boss. I'm using a file with teeth along the edge so that I'm cutting both sides of the corner at the same time. I'm not trying to get the entire bit to be completely flat. In fact, I twist my file slightly to really focus on the corner where it transitions from bit to boss. For shoulder 2, I like to start by focusing on the inside face of the bit. The angle of this face was created when we held our piece at 45 degrees to the anvil edge, so the angle usually needs to be trued up. I like to stand the piece upright in the vise and use the edge of the file with some downward pressure so most of my cutting force is going into the bit, not into the boss. We'll continue cleaning shoulder 2 and also flatten out the inside face of the boss while we're at it. I find that flipping the piece around in the vise makes this a little easier. We're cutting those same two faces as the last step, but now our downward pressure is focused on the boss instead of the bit. While filing, you should regularly compare the two halves of your project. We want to press these together and remove any material that's preventing them from coming into close contact. You'll know that you're finished filing when the holes line up, the base of the bits make contact, there are no major gaps between the bosses on either side, and there are no corners present that would prevent the joint from rotating. Let's put them together. I'll be creating a rivet, but you could instead drill your holes and use a pre-made rivet. I include this part of the project because it's a good exercise for students to know how to size and set rivets by hand. To make a rivet, let's get a piece of 3/8 inch round material and flatten the end. The end of this bar will become a rivet head, and if it has a jagged end, the rivet will curve when we try to set it. Forge lightly back into your hand or tongs and remove any swell that develops. Just go back and forth until you have a reasonably flat end. Now it's very likely that the rivet will not fit into the holes at first. The hole shrank as it cooled and the rivet material has expanded because it's hot. I'm going to very lightly taper the end of this bar until it just fits through both holes. You should be able to push the rivet into the holes with some light twisting force, but it should be a snug fit. The rule of thumb for rivets is to leave 1.5 times the rivet diameter sticking out on each side to become the rivet heads. In this case, that would be almost 1/2 inch, which I think is overkill for small pliers like this, so I'm just going to leave about 3/8 of an inch of material sticking out on that far side. Next, we'll mark where we want to cut the bar. I'll push the rivet back through the plier halves with 3/8 of an inch sticking out on the far side. I'll move around the anvil here so you can see what I'm doing. I eyeball that same distance on the near side of the rivet, about 3/8 of an inch, place the bar on the hardy where I want to cut it, move the pliers out of the way, and hit the bar to mark it. If you're struggling with this maneuver, just quench the bar and mark it cold using chalk or a chisel. Now I can use that mark to cut the rivet off of the bar. It's important to keep the cut centered, as that cut area becomes a rivet head, and if it's not centered, it can cause the rivet to lean over as we try to set it. I cut on all 4 faces, then I cut the corners to make an octagon, and then I finally round up the cut. You should end up with a rivet that's barely hanging on to the very center of the bar. For this next part, we need to hold our plier halves together with the holes lined up. Here's how I do it, but it does leave your hand close to the rivet area. This is a good time to wear a glove on your tong hand, or use vice grips or tongs to keep the halves together during riveting. With your pliers in one hand, take a good heat on the rivet material, push it into the pliers, and break it off the bar. Now we need to get that rivet centered and hammer on each side until the pliers lock together. Unfortunately, I thinned my taper too much on an earlier step, so the rivet doesn't naturally want to stay centered. I have to chase it a little bit here to get it started, and I actually end up with more material on one side of the rivet than the other. If anything goes wrong while you're setting a rivet, the best thing to do is just to stop what you're doing. Running out of heat, it's common to try to hit harder and go faster, but this can ruin your entire project. If a rivet doesn't work out, it's easy to grind one head off, push it out of the holes, and make a new rivet. As I mentioned, I ended up with more material on one side of the rivet than the other, and in this case I'm going to hot rasp that extra material off so the heads end up the same size. This is totally unnecessary, but it's quick to fix and appeals to my vanity. At this point the pliers will likely not rotate. It's actually useful in this case because it'll hold the pliers together while we align everything, and then we can open them up at the very end of the project. After brushing off the scale, I finish setting the rivet with a few light taps, then I round up the head with some angled hammer blows. Here I'm using the near edge of the anvil to support one rivet head at an angle, while rounding the other head with my hammer. Alternatively, you could use a rivet set at this point to get cleaner heads. Now I can lightly push the bits together. Because the pieces are hot, the bits will conform to each other. I'll forge the sides of the bits as well to get them aligned. Alright, let's tune the shape of the handles. Here I mark a center line on the anvil. I copy the curve of one of the handles onto the anvil. And now I can adjust the other handle to match the first one. Again, it doesn't matter what the actual shape is. As long as the two halves are similar, it will look nice. Here I'll lay the handles along the anvil and hammer down each one to make them coplanar with the boss. This makes them feel a little nicer in the hand. To finish, I'm going to hot rasp the bits. This could be done very quickly with a grinder or very slowly with a file once these are cold, but I like to do this hot. I'll even the ends of the bits, clean up the nose of the pliers, and clean up the sides of the bits so that they align well. Be careful not to mark up your rivet during this part. To get these moving, heat up the boss area and quench off the handles. Now gradually wiggle the handles open and closed. This can take several heats, but once you get a little bit of motion, you'll be able to slowly increase the range as you go. If the pliers end up feeling too loose, you can lightly tap the rivet to tighten it up, and then work the handles open and closed again until you get it tuned the way you like it. Finally, we can size the jaws. I put a thin piece of sheet steel into the bits and clamp everything into the vise. As I adjust the handles back and forth to make sure that they look centered, the bits will conform to the size of the sheet steel, leaving a small gap where they're closed. You almost never want your pliers or tongs to close completely, so make sure that you size them to the stock that you're expecting to hold. I hope you try this one yourself. Your first attempt is not going to be perfect, but if you keep making pliers and tongs, you'll notice improvement over time. If there's a particular step you're struggling with, let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see more projects like this, and thanks for watching.